In 1825, workers digging through the dense forests of upstate New York hit something that stopped them cold. Massive bones. Skulls twice the size of a normal man's head. Femurs that suggested heights of 9, 10, even 12 feet tall. The discovery sent shockwaves through the young American Republic. Newspapers from Buffalo to Albany ran frantic reports about a race of giants that once walked the land. Scientists traveled hundreds of miles to examine the remains. Local historians scrambled to document everything before the bones disappeared into private collections or crumbled to dust. But here's what doesn't make sense. Within a generation, these discoveries vanished from the historical record. The bones disappeared. The newspaper accounts were buried in archives. The official history of the Erie Canal mentions engineering marvels and economic transformation, but says nothing about the giants whose bones lined the canal bed. To this day, if you ask a historian about giant skeletons along the Erie Canal, you'll get a dismissive smile and a lecture about frontier mythology. So, what really happened in those forests in 1825? Were the workers lying? Were the newspapers fabricating stories? Or did someone decide that certain discoveries needed to disappear? If you're watching this, hit subscribe. This channel digs into the history they don't teach you, the artifacts they don't display in museums, the questions nobody wants to answer. Every week we go deeper into the mysteries they buried. Now let's talk about what they found in the canal. The Erie Canal wasn't just another construction project. It was one of the most ambitious engineering feats in human history at the time. 363 miles carved through wilderness, swamps, and solid bedrock. From Albany to Buffalo, connecting the Hudson River to Great Lakes, opening the American interior to trade and settlement. They called it Clinton's Ditch, after Governor DeWitt Clinton, the man who championed the project against fierce opposition. Construction began in 1817. The plan was audacious. Nobody in America had ever built anything like it. Most of the workers were Irish immigrants and local farmers who'd never dug more than a well or a root cellar. The engineers were largely self-taught, learning as they went. They had to invent new tools, new techniques, new ways of moving earth and water, on a scale the young nation had never attempted. By 1825, they'd done it. The canal was complete. The celebration was massive. Governor Clinton poured a barrel of Lake Erie water into New York Harbor, symbolically wedding the waters. Cannons fired in sequence along the entire route, an acoustic telegraph announcing America's arrival as an economic power. The canal would transform New York City into the nation's commercial capital and open the Midwest to settlement. But while the celebrations were happening, something else was unfolding. Workers, engineers, and local residents were whispering about what they'd found in the ground, about the bones, about the skulls, about evidence of something that shouldn't have existed. The first reports came from the western sections near Lockport. Workers blasting through the Niagara Escarpment, a ridge of limestone and dolomite that rises hundreds of feet above the surrounding terrain, hit something unexpected. Burial mounds, not small graves. Massive earthwork mounds, some 20 feet high, covering areas the size of several houses. Inside these mounds were chambers, stone-lined vaults, and bones. The discovery happened on October 14th, 1821. A crew had been clearing forest when their shovels hit constructed stone chambers beneath the topsoil. Inside were 3 skeletons, positioned in a seated arrangement, facing east. The bones were massive. The smallest measured just over 9 feet when laid out. The largest reached nearly 11 feet from skull to heel. The local newspaper, the Lockport Observatory, ran the story in its October 18th edition. The reporter, Elihu Burrows, travelled to the site himself. He interviewed the crew members and examined the remains personally. He included detailed measurements in his article. Length of femur, circumference of skull, width of jaw. These weren't estimates. These were precise measurements taken with surveying equipment. He noted that the burial chamber showed sophisticated construction techniques. The stones were fitted together without mortar, yet the seal had remained watertight for centuries. But Lockport wasn't the only location. As the canal pushed east and west, similar discoveries multiplied. Near Palmyra, workers encountered what they described as a necropolis, an entire field of burial sites, stacked in layers, some buried 6 feet deep, others 12 feet down, the deepest nearly 20 feet below the surface. A local doctor named Samuel Mitchell examined the findings. Mitchell had studied medicine in Philadelphia and spent 3 days at the site, carefully measuring and documenting what he found. His notes, published in the Wayne Sentinel in May 1822, measured 17 separate skeletons. The shortest measured 7 feet 4 inches, the tallest measured 11 feet 2 inches. One femur measured 33 inches long. If human proportions held consistent, that suggested an individual standing close to 11 feet tall. Mitchell noted that the bones showed evidence of disease and injury, healed fractures, signs of arthritis, dental wear consistent with a grain-based diet. These weren't mythological beings, they were real people who had lived, worked, and eventually died. The reports kept coming. In 1823, near Syracuse, workers found a stone chamber buried 15 feet below the surface. Inside were 3 skeletons arranged in seated positions, each measuring over 9 feet when laid out straight. The skull showed evidence of trepanation, surgical drilling of holes in the skull. The chamber also contained copper implements, stone axes with carved handles, and what appeared to be astronomical instruments. The excavation was supervised by engineer Canvas White, one of the principal designers of the canal. White documented everything and submitted a detailed report to the Canal Commission in December 1823, recommending the site be preserved for further study. The Commission ordered the excavation to continue. The chamber was destroyed. The remains were sent to a private collector in Albany whose name was never recorded. White's report survived in the Canal Commission archives until 1891, when a fire destroyed the Commission's headquarters. Local historians began collecting accounts. The Ontario Repository published a compilation in 1824 documenting 17 separate discoveries of oversized remains along the canal route. The paper included sworn affidavits from work foremen, measurements taken by physicians, and sketches of some of the skulls. The editor wrote that the evidence was overwhelming. A race of giants had once inhabited the region. The question everyone was asking was simple. Who were they? Some pointed to Native American legends. The Iroquois Confederacy had oral histories about a race of stone giants called the Genesee. According to the stories, these giants were cruel and cannibalistic, terrorizing smaller peoples until they were defeated in a great war. The Iroquois claimed their ancestors had driven the giants north and west into the wilderness beyond the Great Lakes. The Genesee legends were remarkably consistent across different Iroquois nations. The Seneca told stories of giants who could uproot trees. The Oneida spoke of stone-skinned beings nearly impossible to kill. The Mohawk described a great battle where the giants were defeated through cunning rather than strength. What's interesting about these legends is their specificity. They don't describe the giants as supernatural beings or gods. They describe them as people. Dangerous people, but people nonetheless. They ate, slept, built structures, and formed societies. They could be wounded and killed. The stone skin wasn't literal. It was armor, or perhaps a metaphor for their strength. In 1743, French missionary Joseph-François Lafitau published a study of Iroquois culture. He noted that the Iroquois treated giant stories differently from their creation myths. The giant stories were presented as history. Multiple elders independently confirmed the same narrative. There had been giants. There had been a war. The giants had lost. Other legends spoke of the Alejewi, a tall and powerful people who lived in the Ohio River Valley before being displaced by the Iroquois and their allies. The Lenape had detailed accounts of encountering the Alejewi and eventually driving them westward. According to these accounts, the Alejewi were not only tall but also technologically advanced. They built massive fortifications and had organized armies. In 1819, John Heckewelder, a Moravian missionary who had lived among the Lenape for decades, published their oral histories. He documented the Alejewi legends and noted that the Lenape could point to specific locations where battles with the Alejewi had occurred. Some of these locations corresponded with massive earthwork complexes found throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania. The mound builders. That was the other piece of the puzzle. By the 1820s, settlers had discovered thousands of earthwork structures scattered across the interior. Some were simple burial mounds, others were massive geometric complexes perfectly aligned with celestial events. the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, Cahokia in Illinois, the Newark earthworks, structures that rivaled anything built in the ancient world. Cahokia covered 6 square miles at its peak. Its central mound stood 100 feet tall and covered 14 acres at its base, larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Serpent Mound stretched over 1,300 feet long, its shape following a meteor impact crater aligned with sunset on the summer solstice. The Newark earthworks included perfectly circular and octagonal enclosures aligned with the 18.6-year lunar cycle. When European settlers arrived, the Native American tribes they encountered claimed no knowledge of who built the mounds. Some tribes said the mounds were there when their peoples arrived. Others said they were built by giants or gods. Thomas Jefferson excavated mounds on his Virginia property in 1784, documenting multiple layers of burials, but he couldn't determine who had built them or when. The prevailing theory among early scholars was that the mounds were built by a lost civilization that predated known Native American tribes. Some called them the mound builders. Others used the term Tartarians, connecting them to legends of advanced civilizations in Central Asia. The bones found along the Erie Canal seemed to confirm these theories. The giants were the mound builders. But there was a problem. The bones kept disappearing. In 1826, just a year after the canal's completion, physician Nathan Van Allen traveled from New York City to examine the giant remains stored in Lockport. Van Allen had trained at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. When he arrived, the bones were gone. The local historical society claimed they'd been transferred to Albany. Van Allen traveled to Albany. No record existed. He spent 2 weeks tracking leads and published an open letter in the Albany Argus, demanding to know what happened. No investigation was ever conducted. This pattern repeated itself. In 1828, remains from Palmyra disappeared from a private collection during a burglary. Nothing else was taken. In 1832, giant bones displayed in a Rochester classroom vanished overnight from a locked cabinet. No forced entry. In 1835, a Buffalo church reported giant skulls disappeared from a locked display case. Again, no forced entry. Sometimes there were explanations: fires, floods, collectors moving away. But often there was no explanation at all. The bones simply ceased to exist. By the 1850s, the mainstream scientific community had shifted its position. The American Ethnological Society, founded in 1842, began publishing papers arguing that the giant skeletons were either hoaxes or misidentifications. Mastodon bones mistaken for human remains. Exaggerated measurements by untrained observers. Tall tales spun by frontier workers looking to make their mark in the history books. The Smithsonian Institution, established in 1846, took an even harder line. In a series of reports published throughout the 1870s and 1880s, Smithsonian researchers systematically debunked giant skeleton claims. They argued that no credible evidence existed for a race of giants in North America. The mounds were built by ancestors of existing Native American tribes. The legends were just legends. The newspaper accounts were sensationalism. But here's where it gets strange. In 1894, the Smithsonian sent a team led by ethnologist Cyrus Thomas to investigate mound sites in Ohio and West Virginia. Congress appropriated funds specifically for this purpose. The team spent 3 years excavating sites across the Midwest and Southeast, opening hundreds of mounds and cataloging thousands of artifacts. In his official report published in 1894, Thomas concluded that no evidence of giants existed. The mound builders were simply ancestors of contemporary Native American tribes. Case closed. But multiple newspaper accounts from the same period described Thomas's team finding oversized skeletons. The Wheeling Daily Intelligencer reported in April 1883 that Thomas's crew uncovered remains measuring between 7 and 9 feet tall in West Virginia. The article included interviews with team members. The Harrisburg Telegraph ran a similar story citing a different excavation site where Thomas's team found a skeleton measuring 9 feet 2 inches. The Zanesville Courier published an account of Thomas's team discovering a burial chamber containing 5 oversized skeletons near Newark, Ohio. These aren't obscure frontier papers. These are major regional newspapers with professional reporters and editorial standards. Why would multiple credible newspapers report the same discoveries across multiple excavation sites if those discoveries didn't happen? And why does Thomas's official report make no mention of any oversized remains? The answer, according to some researchers, is simple. The Smithsonian suppressed the evidence. This theory gained traction in the late 20th century, fueled by researchers like Richard Dewhurst, who compiled hundreds of newspaper accounts of giant skeleton discoveries in his book, The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America. Dewhurst argues that the Smithsonian systematically acquired and destroyed evidence of giants to support a preferred narrative about human history in the Americas. He points to patterns in the disappearances. Bones discovered by private citizens often vanished after Smithsonian representatives expressed interest in examining them. Excavation sites visited by Smithsonian teams yielded no official documentation, despite contemporary newspaper reports of discoveries. The Smithsonian denies these allegations. In official statements, the institution maintains that no evidence of a cover-up exists. They argue that many supposed giant skeletons were never actually measured by qualified individuals. Frontier newspapers were notorious for sensationalism. Measurements were often estimates rather than precise calculations, and given the poor preservation methods of the 19th century, many legitimate remains simply deteriorated before they could be properly studied. But that explanation doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain why so many credible observers reported the same findings. It doesn't explain why detailed measurements taken by trained physicians suddenly vanished from the record. It doesn't explain why affidavits signed under oath disappeared from local archives, and it doesn't explain what happened to the bones found along the Erie Canal. Let's return to 1825, to the forests and swamps of upstate New York, to the workers who spent 8 years digging through earth and stone. These weren't educated men. Most couldn't read or write. They had no agenda beyond earning wages and surviving brutal working conditions. When they found bones that dwarfed their own, they had no reason to lie about it. When they brought these remains to foremen and engineers, they weren't trying to rewrite history. They were reporting what they'd found. The foremen took the reports seriously. Work was halted at several sites while the discoveries were documented. Local officials were notified. In some cases, the remains were carefully extracted and preserved. Measurements were taken, sketches were made, affidavits were signed. This wasn't folklore. This was documented evidence recorded by multiple independent sources preserved in newspapers, journals, and local records. For over a century, this evidence was accessible. Researchers could examine the original documents. Museums displayed some of the remains. The story of the Erie Canal giants was part of regional history. Then something changed. Starting in the early 20th century, the evidence began disappearing. Newspaper archives were purged. Local historical societies claimed their records had been lost or destroyed. Museums removed the remains from display, citing concerns about preservation or sensitivity to Native American communities. By the 1960s, the official story had been rewritten. The Erie Canal giants became a myth, a curious footnote in frontier history. Nothing more. But the question remains, if these discoveries were hoaxes or misidentifications, why go to such lengths to erase them from the record? Why not simply present the evidence of the hoax, show how the measurements were exaggerated, demonstrate that the bones were actually from large animals, prove that the whole thing was frontier sensationalism? Instead, the evidence was removed entirely. That's not how you handle a hoax. That's how you handle something you don't want people examining too closely. Some researchers connect the Erie Canal discoveries to broader patterns of evidence suppression. The Smithsonian has faced accusations of hiding or destroying artifacts that don't fit the accepted narrative for over a century. In the 1960s, Native American activists accused the institution of warehousing thousands of indigenous remains in storage facilities, keeping them from public view and tribal representatives. The controversy eventually led to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, which required museums to return certain artifacts and remains to tribal communities. But even that legislation had limitations. It only applied to remains that could be definitively linked to existing tribes. What about remains that predated known tribal histories? What about the giants? The official answer is that no such remains exist. According to mainstream archaeology, all human remains found in North America belong to ancestors of contemporary Native American populations. There is no lost race, no giants, no mound builders distinct from indigenous peoples. The entire idea, they argue, is rooted in racism and colonialism, an attempt to deny Native Americans credit for the sophisticated civilizations they built. That argument has merit. There's no question that 19th century scholars often used the mound builder theory to dispossess Native Americans of their heritage. By claiming that the mounds were built by a lost white race, settlers could justify seizing indigenous lands and dismissing native cultures as primitive. But here's the problem. Debunking racist theories doesn't make the physical evidence disappear. The bones were real, the measurements were documented, the discoveries happened. You can condemn the racist interpretations of those discoveries without denying that the discoveries themselves occurred. Unless, of course, the discoveries challenge something even more fundamental than 19th century racism. Unless they challenge our entire understanding of human history. This is where the Tartaria theory enters the conversation. Tartaria, or Tartary, appears on maps of Asia and Eastern Europe from the 15th through 19th centuries. It's depicted as a vast empire stretching from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to India. Most historians treat Tartaria as a catch-all term for the various nomadic peoples and kingdoms that inhabited Central Asia, regions that European cartographers knew existed but understood poorly. But according to alternative historians, Tartaria was something more. A globe-spanning civilization with advanced technology, sophisticated architecture, and influence that reached far beyond Asia. They point to architectural anomalies, buildings across Europe, Asia, and North America that share similar design elements despite being separated by thousands of miles and supposedly centuries of time. Grand structures with elaborate facades, advanced infrastructure, and engineering that seems impossibly sophisticated for the periods in which they were supposedly built. The theory suggests that this Tartarian civilization was deliberately erased from history, that sometime in the 18th or 19th century, a global catastrophe or a coordinated effort by emerging powers destroyed Tartaria and rewrote the historical record. Buildings that were originally Tartarian were attributed to other cultures. Artifacts were hidden or destroyed. The very existence of the civilization was scrubbed from official accounts. And the giants? According to Tartarian theorists, they were the builders, the architects of the advanced civilization that once dominated the world. The Erie Canal discoveries weren't isolated anomalies. They were part of a pattern of evidence pointing to a truth that someone desperately wants to keep buried. Mainstream historians and archaeologists dismiss Tartaria theories as pseudoscience. They point out that there's no credible evidence for a lost global civilization. The architectural similarities cited by theorists can be explained by trade, cultural exchange, and the natural evolution of building techniques. The supposed anomalies are either misunderstood, misrepresented, or outright fabricated. But then you're left with the question we started with. What happened to the bones they found when they dug the Erie Canal? Let's consider the possibilities. First, the hoax theory. Workers and foremen fabricated the discoveries, either for attention or to create local legends. The problem with this theory is scale. We're talking about dozens of separate discoveries over 8 years, reported by different crews in different locations, documented by different newspapers and officials. That's a massive conspiracy involving hundreds of people with no apparent motive. Workers were paid by the day, not by the discovery. Creating elaborate hoaxes would have slowed down construction and risked their employment. Second, the misidentification theory. The bones were from large animals, not humans, and frontier observers lacked the training to tell the difference. The problem here is that physicians and trained naturalists examined many of the remains. They documented human skeletal structures, not animal bones. They noted details like the articulation of joints, the structure of the pelvis, the formation of the skull. These weren't casual glances. These were careful examinations by people with medical training. Third, the exaggeration theory. The bones were human, but measurements were inflated through poor technique or deliberate sensationalism. This theory has more plausibility. 19th century measurement standards weren't always precise, but it doesn't explain the affidavits. Multiple sources swore under oath that they'd measured remains over 9 feet in length. Lying under oath about something this specific and verifiable carried serious legal consequences. Fourth, the suppression theory. The discoveries were real, the measurements accurate, but the evidence was systematically removed because it challenged accepted narratives about human history. This theory explains the disappearances, but requires us to accept that institutions like the Smithsonian engaged in large-scale evidence destruction. That's a significant claim requiring significant proof. Or there's a fifth possibility. The bones were real, the measurements accurate, but rather than being suppressed, they were simply lost to time, neglect, and the chaos of a rapidly expanding nation. Artifacts disappear all the time, especially in the 19th century when preservation methods were primitive and institutional care was haphazard. Maybe there's no conspiracy, maybe it's just entropy. But entropy doesn't explain why the newspaper accounts were removed from archives. It doesn't explain why local historical societies claim records were destroyed. It doesn't explain the patterns of disappearance that consistently follow the same script. Discovery, documentation, institutional interest, disappearance. Here's what we know for certain. Between 1817 and 1825, workers building the Erie Canal found human remains of unusual size in burial mounds and earthworks along the canal route. These discoveries were documented in multiple newspapers, examined by physicians and naturalists, and stored in local collections. Within a few generations, nearly all physical evidence vanished. The story was reclassified from historical fact to frontier mythology. What you choose to believe about that timeline is up to you. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, that the evidence needs to be debated rather than examined, tells you something important. Somewhere along the way, someone decided that certain questions shouldn't be asked, that certain possibilities shouldn't be considered, that history is settled, the narrative fixed, the case closed. But history isn't settled. It's constantly being rewritten as new evidence emerges and old assumptions are challenged. The problem is when evidence doesn't emerge because it was never allowed to survive. When questions aren't answered because they were never allowed to be asked. The Erie Canal giants represent something larger than a regional mystery. They represent a pattern of knowledge suppression that extends across centuries and continents. Whether you believe in Tartaria, in ancient advanced civilizations, in races of giants or lost empires, the underlying question remains the same. Who controls the past? Who decides what evidence matters? Who determines which discoveries get preserved and which get buried? These aren't just academic questions, they cut to the heart of how we understand ourselves, our history, and our place in the world. If the official story is incomplete or deliberately misleading, then everything built on that foundation becomes suspect. Every textbook, every museum exhibit, every confident declaration about what is and isn't possible in human history. The bones they found when they dug the Erie Canal might be gone, but the questions they raised remain. And as long as those questions remain unanswered, as long as evidence continues to disappear and narratives continue to shift, people will keep digging, not just through earth and stone, but through archives and records, looking for the truth that someone worked so hard to bury. The canal is still there. 300 tanks, 63 miles of water cutting through upstate New York, carrying barges and tourists, and the weight of a history nobody talks about anymore. If you walk along its banks, you're walking over ground that once held secrets, secrets that workers uncovered with shovels and sweat, secrets that were documented, preserved, and then erased. But erasure isn't the same as absence. The evidence may be gone, but the pattern remains. The questions persist. And every time someone digs a little deeper, asks one more uncomfortable question, or refuses to accept the official story without examination, those secrets come a little closer to the surface. That's what this channel is about. Digging deeper, asking questions, refusing to accept that history is settled just because someone in authority says it is. Every week we explore the mysteries they don't want you examining, the artifacts they hide in storage, the discoveries that don't fit the narrative. If that interests you, if you want to keep questioning, keep digging, keep searching for truth in the places they tell you not to look, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now, and next week we'll explore another buried chapter of history. Another mystery that someone worked hard to erase. Another piece of the puzzle that might just change everything you thought you knew. The bones are gone, but the truth is still out there. You just have to be willing to dig for it.